I owe a woman an apology that I've been carrying for 3 years, and I still haven't found the right words for it, which is ironic, because words have never been my problem. Words are the thing I have too many of. I've always had an opinion ready before the situation finished introducing itself. I've always spoken first and understood later, and I wore that like a personality trait instead of recognizing it for what it actually was, a disability dressed up as confidence. My name is Odette Wynn, and I'm going to tell you about the quietest woman I've ever met and how I almost destroyed her life because her silence made me uncomfortable. She worked for my brother. She barely spoke. She showed up early, did beautiful work, ate her lunch alone, and left at the same time every single day. And because she never explained herself, never volunteered the details that I believed I was entitled to, I decided she was dangerous. Not dangerous the way a person with a weapon is dangerous. Dangerous the way a locked door is dangerous to someone who's convinced themselves they have a right to every room in the house. I looked at a woman who was keeping her life private, and I treated that privacy like a crime scene. I collected evidence. I built a case. I watched her the way you watch someone you've already convicted, where everything they do confirms the sentence you wrote before the trial started. I was wrong. I was wrong in a way that cost my brother time with his own child. I was wrong in a way that almost cost a woman the only safety she'd been able to build. And I was wrong in a way that should terrify you, because the kind of wrong I was doesn't feel like wrong when you're inside it. It feels like love. It feels like protection. It feels like being the only person in the room smart enough to see what everyone else is missing. That's the most dangerous thing a person can feel, certainty that their suspicion is the same as sight. I watched this happen and did nothing useful. I had every opportunity to ask a simple question, to extend basic grace, to treat another human being's quietness as something other than a threat aimed at my family. I didn't. And if this story sounds familiar to you, if you've ever looked at someone who keeps to themselves and decided that their silence was the thing to be suspicious of, subscribe to this channel right now, because what I'm about to tell you is what that instinct costs when you're wrong, and the price is higher than you think. Let me take you back to where it started. Asheville, North Carolina. A carpentry shop called Wynn and Grain, and a woman named Isolde Marchetti, who walked through the front door with a one-page resume and hands that could make dead wood remember what it used to be. My brother Stellan built Wynn and Grain from nothing recognizable. 12 years ago, he had one table saw, a truck he'd borrowed from a friend who owed him a favor, and the kind of stubborn belief in his own hands that only makes sense in retrospect, once it actually works. Today, the shop employs 14 people and specializes in reclaimed wood furniture and historical property repairs, the kind of work where you're not just building something new, you're honoring something old. Stellan has always understood that. He treats wood the way good doctors treat patients. He listens to it before he decides what it needs. I handle his books part-time, which means I'm in that building 2 or 3 days a week. I know the sound the front door makes when the humidity is high. I know which floorboard groans near the tool cage. I know the rhythms of that shop the way you know the rhythms of any place you've claimed partial ownership of. Not because it belongs to you, but because someone you love built it, and you've decided that loving them means supervising the building. 3 years ago, Stellan hired Isolde Marchetti for finish work, staining, sealing, detail sanding, the fine touch end of the craft that separates furniture that functions from furniture that speaks. She'd applied with a resume that barely filled a page, no professional references, and a portfolio of photographs showing restoration work on antique cabinetry that made Stellan's foreman let out a low whistle and say, "Whoever did this has hands that listen to wood." Stellan hired her the same day. He told me about it that evening over dinner at our mother's house, and the only thing he said was, "She doesn't talk much, but her work speaks plenty." That was the entire report. No details about where she came from, who she'd worked for before, what her story was. I filed that away, not as admiration, as a gap I would spend the next 2 years trying to fill with my own assumptions. I met Isolde on a Saturday. I'd stopped by the shop to drop off invoices, and she was in the back finishing room alone, running a cloth along a chestnut tabletop with the kind of concentration that seals the room around the person doing the work. She didn't hear me come in. I said hello. She looked up, nodded, a single clean nod that communicated acknowledgement without inviting continuation, and went back to her cloth and her wood. That was our entire relationship for 6 months. I would arrive, she would nod, and we would exist in the same building without exchanging more than 4 words in any given week. I want to be honest about something here, because this story falls apart if I pretend I was fair. I wasn't. I had a reaction to Isolde Marchetti that I dressed in responsible clothing and called instinct, but it was prejudice walking upright in better shoes. She was beautiful, dark-haired, deliberate in her movements, with the kind of quiet that felt chosen rather than natural. And she worked for my brother, my unmarried, soft-hearted, trusting brother who had a documented history of seeing the best in people long past the point where the best had packed its bags and caught an earlier flight. I decided within a week that Isolde was someone to watch, not because she'd done a single thing wrong, because a beautiful woman who doesn't explain herself activates something territorial in the women who've appointed themselves as gatekeepers. I was a gatekeeper. I hadn't yet learned that gatekeeping is just control with a family photo taped to the front of it. So I watched, and what I cataloged for months was a pattern I interpreted as suspicious because I'd already decided the woman inside the pattern was suspect. Isolde came to work early. She stayed in her finishing room. She ate lunch alone every day, the same container of rice and vegetables consumed at a small table near the loading dock. No company, no phone out, no conversation. She answered direct questions with the fewest possible words, and she left at 5:15 every single day without exception. Not 5:10, not 5:20, 5:15, like something on the other side of that door had a timer attached to it. Everyone else on the crew had flexible hours. They stayed late when a project demanded it, came in on weekends during crunch periods. Isolde left at 5:15 as if the clock owned her. I stored that detail the way prosecutors store receipts. Not because it proved anything on its own, but because I was building a file, and files need volume to feel convincing. Even when every page says the same thing, I don't know this woman, and I've decided that not knowing is enough to condemn her. Here's the thing about watching someone so closely that you forget to look at anything else. You miss the earthquake happening in the next room because you're too busy measuring cracks in the wrong wall. While I was busy cataloging Isolde's lunch containers and departure times, something was happening to my brother that I should have recognized immediately. Stellan was changing, not in the dramatic, obvious way that sets off alarms. In the quiet way, the rearranging way, the kind of change that only becomes visible once you stop looking at the person you've decided is the threat and start paying attention to the person you claimed you were trying to protect. It started with the workbench. Stellan's primary bench had been positioned near the front of the main workshop since the day he opened the shop, close to the entrance, close to clients, close to the flow of materials coming in and finished pieces going out. One Monday morning, I came in to reconcile receipts and found that he'd moved it, not across the building, just 15 feet deeper into the workshop, 15 feet closer to the finishing room, 15 feet closer to the interior window that separated his workspace from Isolde's. When I asked him about it, he shrugged and said the light was better on that side. The light was identical on both sides. The shop has overhead fluorescents spaced evenly across the entire ceiling. But I accepted the answer because the real explanation, the one standing quietly behind his shrug, would have required me to acknowledge something my authority couldn't afford. Then came the questions. Stellan started consulting Isolde on grain patterns and wood selection. He'd carry a plank into the finishing room and hold it up and ask her what she saw in it. Not the way a boss tests an employee, but the way a craftsman defers to someone whose eye catches what his misses. I heard him tell his foreman once, with a respect in his voice that I'd never heard him extend to anyone in that shop. She sees things in timber that I've been walking past for a decade. His foreman raised an eyebrow. Stellan didn't notice. He was already carrying another piece of reclaimed oak toward the finishing room, like a man who'd suddenly discovered that the most interesting conversation in his life was happening in a room he used to walk past without stopping. He moved his entire workspace to be 10 feet closer to a woman he barely spoke to. He started asking her opinions that he had never needed from anyone. He began staying later at the shop, not working, just present, finding reasons to be in the building during the hours when the crew thinned out and the noise dropped, and the only sounds were Isolde's cloth against wood and the low creak of a man rearranging his whole life around a gravitational pull he hadn't named yet. What do you think was really happening? Tell me in the comments, because I promise you, whatever you're guessing right now, I didn't guess it for another full year. I labeled it professional respect. I told myself Stellan was mentoring her, or learning from her, or doing the thing good business owners do when they recognize talent on their team. I gave it every name except the one it actually had, because naming it correctly would have meant admitting that my brother's heart had made a choice that my judgment hadn't been consulted on, and my judgment, my confident, loud, always ready judgment, had never once in 31 years accepted the possibility that it was not the highest authority in any room it entered. So I watched my brother fall in love with a woman I'd already decided was untrustworthy, and I called his falling something else entirely. I called it a phase. I called it seasonal restlessness. I called it the natural response of a lonely man working in close quarters with a skilled colleague. I called it everything I could afford to call it, because the truth, that Stellan was choosing someone I hadn't vetted, someone I couldn't read, someone whose silence made my certainty feel like the fragile thing it actually was. That truth had a price tag I wasn't ready to look at. The moment I should have changed course came on a Thursday afternoon in the second year of Isolde's employment, and I let it pass through my hands like water because catching it would have meant opening them, and my fists were too full of the story I'd already decided was true. I was in the supply closet adjacent to the finishing room, counting jars of wood stain and updating the inventory sheet. Routine work. Quiet afternoon. Most of the crew was on site at a historical renovation across town, and the shop had that hollow, settled feeling a building gets when it's holding fewer people than it was built for. I heard the finishing room door open, and then I heard my brother's voice through the thin wall that separated us. He wasn't talking about wood grain. You don't have to carry everything alone. That was what he said, and his voice had a texture I had never heard from him in 31 years of being his sister. Low, careful, stripped of the easygoing warmth he draped over every interaction like a man who'd learned early that being likable was the safest way to move through the world. This wasn't Stellan being likable. This was Stellan being bare. This was my brother without the thing I hadn't known he was wearing until I heard what he sounded like without it. And it frightened me, because if Stellan had armor, then Stellan had wounds. And if Stellan had wounds I didn't know about, then the version of him I'd built my entire role around protecting was incomplete. And an incomplete version meant I'd been guarding a drawing of my brother instead of my actual brother. Isolde's response was so quiet I almost missed it through the wall. But I caught it, and I have turned it over in my mind 1,000 times since, and I still believe it's the most important sentence I've ever overheard and the one I understood the least at the time it mattered most. Carrying it alone is the only version where nobody else gets hurt. Nobody else. She didn't say the only version where I don't get hurt. She said the only version where nobody else gets hurt. She was protecting someone beyond herself, someone whose safety depended on her silence the way a roof depends on the beams staying where they are, not because the beams want to hold still, but because the whole structure falls if they shift. I didn't hear that. I heard a woman confirming that she was keeping secrets. I heard evidence. I heard the locked door I'd been pressing my ear against for 2 years finally making a sound from the other side, and instead of recognizing that the sound was grief, I filed it as guilt. Silence, the kind that has its own pulse. Then footsteps, and Stellan walked past the supply closet without seeing me standing 3 feet from the open door. His face held the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he'd already decided to jump into despite not knowing the depth. That expression should have told me everything. A man doesn't look like that about a colleague. A man looks like that about a future. I should have gone to him that night. I should have sat down across his kitchen table and said, "Tell me what's happening, because I can see that something is, and I want to understand it instead of judging it." But going to Stellan would have meant confessing that I'd been listening, that I'd been watching, that the protective sister routine was really a surveillance operation with a family discount. It would have meant admitting that I'd been wrong about Isolde, wrong to distrust her, wrong to build a prosecution out of her silence, and her punctuality, and her beauty. And admitting I was wrong would have cost me the only role I knew how to play in my brother's life. So I didn't go to him. I went in the opposite direction. I doubled down. I started visiting the shop more often. I created filing projects that didn't need to exist. I lingered near the finishing room with a clipboard and a purpose I'd manufactured out of fear. Because when the truth threatens your position, the most human thing in the world is to grip that position tighter and pretend the threat is coming from somewhere else. The fracture happened on a Thursday evening in late autumn. The shop was quiet. Most of the crew had clocked out. I was at the front desk finishing payroll. Legitimate work, for once, not an excuse I'd invented to keep my eyes on a room I had no business monitoring. Isolde had stepped out to the loading dock to check a delivery manifest, and her phone was sitting on the workbench in the finishing room where she'd left it beside a half-sealed oak panel. It rang 4 times. I should not have looked. I knew I should not have looked, the way you know you shouldn't open a letter that doesn't have your name on it. Not because someone told you, but because the knowledge is built into the act itself. Looking at someone's phone without permission is a decision. It's a choice with a direction, and the direction is towards something you cannot unchoose. But I had spent 2 years building a case against this woman out of lunch containers and departure times and overheard fragments, and that phone ringing in an empty room felt like the universe handing me the final exhibit. So I walked into the finishing room, and I looked. The screen said, Ridgeview Children's Clinic, a children's clinic. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs, and I want to be precise about what that coldness was, because this is the part of the story where my own memory tries to protect me, and I can't let it. It was not concern. It was not worry for Isolde, or whoever was connected to that clinic. It was calculation. It was the specific, satisfying chill of a person who has been hunting for confirmation and has finally found something that looks like prey. She had a child. She'd never mentioned a child. Not to Stellan, not to the crew, not to me. This was the secret. This was the engine behind the 5:15 departures, and the silence and the locked door life I'd been trying to pick open for 2 years. I was right. She was hiding something, and being right felt better than it should have, which should have been my first warning that something inside me had gone deeply wrong. What I did next is the part of this story that I will carry for the rest of my life, and I will deserve to carry it because I did it with precision. I did it with intention. I didn't stumble into this mistake. I walked into it wearing my best shoes. I told Stellan, but I didn't tell him the way a concerned sister tells her brother something she overheard. I told him with framing. I selected my words the way a carpenter selects which grain to show and which to hide, except I was building something designed to damage instead of something designed to hold weight. I said, a children's clinic, Stellan. She has a kid she's never mentioned. What else is she not telling you? I watched his face as the words landed. I expected alarm. I expected the sharp intake of breath that comes when someone realizes they've been standing next to a stranger. I expected him to look at me with gratitude because I, his vigilant, devoted, always watching sister, had finally delivered the proof that would validate everything I'd been feeling since the day Isolde nodded at me and went back to her wood. That is not what happened. Stellan looked at me for a long time, long enough that the silence between us stopped being a pause and became a room I was trapped in. Then he said something that broke the floor I'd been standing on for 2 years. Maybe she's not telling me because nobody's made it safe enough for her to speak. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse me of snooping. He didn't defend Isolde or attack me or do any of the things that would have given me something to push back against. He just stood there with a sadness on his face that I had never seen from him before. Not sadness about Isolde's secret, but sadness about his own failure to become the person she believed she could trust with the truth. He was grieving his own inadequacy, and the look he gave me, not angry, just deeply, terribly aware, told me that he understood exactly why I had brought this to him. And the reason had never been love. It had been control. I had dressed up my need to manage his life as devotion, and he could see the stitching. I went home that night and sat in my kitchen for 2 hours without turning on the lights. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there in the dark with the full weight of what I'd done pressing against my chest like a hand holding me in a chair I deserved to sit in. I sat in my dark kitchen for 2 hours because I couldn't face what I'd done under good lighting. If you know someone who watches people the way I watched Isolde, who calls their suspicion love and their surveillance devotion, share this video with them, not to punish them, not to accuse them. Share it to show them what I didn't see until it was almost too late. That the most dangerous thing you can do to someone you love is appoint yourself the judge of who's allowed to love them back. What happened next, I learned in fragments. Some from Stellan directly, some from what I pieced together through observation once I finally stopped observing like a prosecutor and started paying attention like a human being. My brother did not do the thing I would have done. He did not confront Isolde. He did not walk into the finishing room the next morning with the information I'd handed him and demand an explanation. He did not treat what I told him like a weapon, because unlike me, Stellan understood that knowing something about someone is not the same as being owed the rest. He waited. I don't know how long that waiting cost him. I don't know what it feels like to learn that the woman you've been falling for in slow, quiet inches has a child she's never mentioned, and to respond to that information not with interrogation but with patience. I only know what I would have done, and what I would have done would have destroyed everything that happened next. On a Friday afternoon, when the shop was nearly empty, and the last of the crew had packed out early for the weekend, Stellan walked into the finishing room. Isolde was at her bench. He sat down across from her, not behind his authority as her employer, not with the leverage of what he knew, but across from her, level, the way you sit with someone when you want them to understand that the conversation is between equals and the door behind them is not locked. He said, I want you to know that whatever you're carrying, you can set it down in this room. I'm not going to pick it up and use it against you. Stellan told me later what happened in the silence that followed. Isolde didn't move. She sat with her hands flat on the workbench, palms pressed against the surface the way you press your hands against something solid when the ground underneath you is shifting and you need to feel something that isn't going anywhere. She stared at the wood grain beneath her fingers, as if the answer to what she should do next was written in the rings of a tree that had taken 100 years to grow. 3 full minutes. Stellan counted. He said those 3 minutes were the longest he'd ever sat with another person without speaking, and he let. Every second of them belonged to her, because he understood, in a way I was still years from understanding, that silence is not always an absence. Sometimes silence is a woman deciding whether the person in front of her has earned the most expensive thing she owns, which is the truth. Then she told him. His name was Oren. He was 3 years old. He had Stellan's jaw, that squared-off, stubborn line that every Wynn inherits whether they want it or not, and Stellan's habit of tilting his head slightly to the left when he was thinking. He had been born 37 weeks after a weekend that Isolde and Stellan had never spoken about. A weekend 4.5 years earlier, before she'd ever set foot in Wynn and Grain, when they'd met at a reclaimed materials expo in Knoxville, Tennessee. 2 days. That's what they'd had. A connection so immediate and so consuming that neither of them had handled it with anything resembling good judgment. They'd spent 48 hours talking about wood and craft and the things that mattered to them in ways they hadn't talked to anyone else, and then they'd parted without exchanging last names or phone numbers because the honesty between them had felt too large for logistics. Stellan never contacted her afterward. He convinced himself that a woman like Isolde, talented, precise, self-contained, couldn't possibly want a man who smelled like sawdust and spent his weekends sanding other people's history. Isolde disappeared because she believed that a weekend was the most she was allowed to have, and wanting more would only confirm what she'd spent her life being taught, that asking for something meant losing it. She found out she was pregnant 6 weeks later. She had no number, no last name, no address, just Stellan and something about carpentry in western North Carolina, which wasn't enough to find anyone. She stopped searching after 3 months. She had Oren. She raised him in a studio apartment on temp work and the kind of budget discipline that turns rice and vegetables into a permanent lunch because every dollar has already been assigned a destination before it arrives. She kept them alive. She kept them quiet. She kept going. And then, 2 years into that life, she found a job posting online for a Finnish carpenter at a shop called Wynn and Grain. The name meant nothing to her. She drove to Asheville for the interview, walked through the front door holding her portfolio, and saw my brothers standing behind the counter. She told Stellan she almost left. She stood on the sidewalk outside the shop for 11 minutes. She counted them the way he'd counted the 3 minutes of silence, holding her work samples against her chest and trying to calculate whether walking through that door was the bravest thing she'd ever do, or the most reckless. She went in because Oren needed health insurance. She stayed silent because she had done the math with the ruthless precision that single motherhood teaches you, and the math said that her son's stability was worth more than her need to be seen. She chose to be invisible so that her child could have a doctor. She chose to sit 10 feet from Oren's father every single day and say nothing, because speaking meant risking the only safe thing she'd built, and she had a 3-year-old boy whose safety was not a thing she could gamble with, no matter how heavy the silence became. Every detail I had cataloged as suspicious now had its real name. The 5:15 departures, daycare pickup, the same lunch every day, a single mother's budget, stretched to its edges, with no room for the cafeteria down the street. The silence, not deception, not scheming, not the behavior of a woman with something to hide, The behavior of a woman with everything to protect. She chose to be invisible so her child could be safe. She sat 10 feet from her son's father for 3 years and said nothing. Not because she didn't want to, but because she'd done the math and decided her own voice was worth less than her son's health insurance. If that doesn't deserve your like, I don't know what story ever will. Hit that button right now, because what this woman did was not weakness. It was the most expensive kind of strength there is. Stellan went to Isolde's apartment on a Saturday morning. He told me about it a week later, sitting on our mother's porch, speaking slowly, choosing his words with the kind of care I had never once seen him bring to a conversation with me. He said it the way someone describes a morning that divided their life into before and after, not with drama, but with the quiet precision of a man still making sure it actually happened. He'd brought a gift, a small wooden car he'd made in the shop after hours, hand-carved from walnut, sanded smooth enough to run against a child's cheek without catching, with 4 wheels that actually turned on tiny dowel axles. He'd spent 3 evenings on it. 3 evenings shaping something for a son he hadn't known existed a week earlier. Because Stellan's first instinct when the world hands him something overwhelming is to go to his bench and build something that fits in a small hand. Isolde opened the door, and behind her, at hip height, was a boy with my brother's jaw and my brother's head tilt and my mother's dark eyes. Stellan knelt down on the hallway carpet, not because he planned to, I don't think, but because his legs understood something before his mind caught up, and held out the walnut car and said, "I heard you like things that move." Oren took the car, looked at it the way children look at things that have been made specifically for them, with the seriousness of someone who understands, at a level adults have forgotten, that a gift made by hand carries the hours inside it. Then he sat down on the floor and rolled it, and Stellan sat down across from him, and the car went back and forth between them while Isolde stood in the doorway watching something she had imagined 1,000 times but never allowed herself to expect. She told me, months later, after she and I had begun the slow, cautious work of building something that might eventually earn the word friendship, that she cried that morning, not in front of them. She waited until Stellan and Oren were on the floor together, the walnut car tracking small arcs across the carpet between them, and she stepped into the kitchen and pressed both hands flat against the counter, and let 3 years of carrying come out of her body in a way that had no sound. She said it wasn't sadness. It was the specific grief of a weight being lifted, the grief your muscles feel when they finally release a load they'd been holding so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. What came after was not effortless. I want to be clear about that, because the version of this story where everything becomes easy the moment the truth arrives is a version that insults what both of them had to build. It was work. But it was the kind of work my brother does best, the kind that respects what's already there. You don't restore a piece of old-growth furniture by tearing it down and starting over. You strip away what's damaged without destroying what's original. You follow the grain that exists instead of forcing the wood into a shape it was never grown for. Saturday mornings became their ritual, then weekend afternoons, then the 5:15 departures, the ones I'd cataloged as evidence, the ones I'd stored in my file of suspicion, shifted to 5:45 because Stellan started driving Isolde home after work. And somewhere during those 30-minute drives through Asheville, with the windows down and the Blue Ridge fading into dusk behind them, they began saying the things they should have said in Knoxville 4 years earlier. The real things, the scared things, the things you only say when you've learned that the person next to you isn't going to treat your honesty like a liability. I watched all of this from the edges, not as a gatekeeper anymore, as a guest who was slowly, painfully earning back the trust she'd spent entirely on surveillance. Stellan didn't shut me out. That's not who he is. But he tested me. He offered small pieces of his happiness to see if I would hold them with care or inspect them for defects. I held them. I'm still learning how the moment that changed me, the one I keep returning to when I need to remember who I was and who I'm trying to become, happened on an ordinary evening. I stopped by the shop to pick up tax documents. Nothing significant, nothing scheduled, just a Tuesday errand that put me at the front door at the exact right time to see something I didn't deserve to witness, but desperately needed to. The overhead lights were off. Only the finishing room lamps were on, casting warm amber through the interior window into the darkened workshop. Oren was seated on a stool beside Isolde's bench, holding a small cloth, mimicking his mother's movements, running the fabric along the grain of a sample board with a seriousness so complete and so precise that it looked like prayer. Isolde was beside him, guiding without correcting, her hand near his but not touching it, letting him find the rhythm the way she found everything. Through patience, through repetition, through the quiet belief that things done carefully enough will eventually teach themselves. Stellan was at his workbench across the room. He wasn't watching Oren. He was watching Isolde watch Oren, and the expression on his face was something I don't have a sophisticated word for, so I'll use the one that's true. He was home, not in the building he owned, not in the shop he'd built. Home in the way that has nothing to do with walls and everything to do with the moment you stop searching, because the thing you were looking for is in the room and it knows your name. I stood in that doorway, and I felt myself become smaller, not diminished, corrected, reduced to my actual size, which was a woman who had spent 3 years reading silence as threat instead of wound, privacy as deception instead of survival, and beauty as a weapon instead of the least important thing about a person who was extraordinary in ways I hadn't bothered to look for. Stellan and Isolde are engaged now. A quiet ceremony is planned for the spring. Oren will carry the rings, and I've been asked to do a reading, which is either the most generous thing my brother has ever done, or the most pointed, because standing in front of people and saying something that matters requires exactly the skill I have been worst at my entire life, listening before I speak. Here is what I learned, and here is what I need you to carry out of this story tonight. If you are someone who watches, if your love for the people closest to you has turned into surveillance, if your suspicion has started wearing the uniform of perception, if your inability to be wrong has become indistinguishable from being right, hear me. Suspicion is not sight. Vigilance is not love. And when someone's life doesn't make sense to you, when their silence seems excessive, when their privacy seems suspicious, when their refusal to perform openness makes you uneasy, consider before you build your theory that they might be surviving something you have never had to survive. Their silence is not a wall built to keep you out. It's a roof built to keep their child dry. And if you are the one carrying something in silence right now, if you've been surviving alone because you calculated that alone was safer than trusting someone who might not stay, I need you to hear this. The right person will not make you prove you deserve to be heard. They will not treat your truth like a test you need to pass. They'll sit across from you and wait, and when you're ready, they'll say the thing my brother said, the thing that didn't demand Isolde to speak but made speaking finally feel safe. You can set it down in this room. Set it down. If either of those morals found you tonight, if you're the one watching or the one being watched, subscribe to this channel right now. Because every story we tell here is built for that exact moment, the moment you realize the version you've been telling yourself isn't the whole truth. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.